The destructive economics of mass migration. I almost wonder if this is deliberate, actually. We're going to talk about this article I was reading. I did this on my live stream the other night on locals. So if you're interested in joining the locals page, I got a link in the show notes. $5 a month. You can do our live stream. We do it every Wednesday at 7. Usually we'll just read an article, like read an article here. We did that last time. We'll read another article, talk about it. America's foreign trade mess. All these articles right here we'll read. Measuring shortages, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and you have access to them all. So if you want to join the locals, Josh Scanlon, it's joshscanlon.locals.com, $5 a month. Love to have it. All right, so let's read this from my man. This is written in 1998, before the mass migration we've been over the last 15 years. So just the 10 years probably, 15. So just freaking, it so pisses me off. This is from Jeffrey Williamson, who's over here. Who's Jeffrey Williamson? He's the Laird Bell Professor at Harvard. He's an honorary fellow at the Department of Economics, University of Wisconsin, blah, blah, blah. And he wrote this book that looks very interesting, Unequal Gains. I'm very much looking forward to reading that because, dude, I used to believe free trade, free markets, free minds. That's what the Reason magazine, Reason magazine, yeah. I used to have a t-shirt in the 90s, free trade, free markets, free minds. And the idea was that you could just have perpetual free trade. You could have everyone just going border to border. It's all good. And then I started coming to the conclusion that libertarians don't like they don't like the United States. They don't like national sovereignty. And I'm using this, yes, I'm painting with a broad brush. But many libertarians don't like national sovereignty. They don't. And if you can just ask them. They'll tell you this. Do you like borders? There'll be some who say yes, but many don't. They just don't like America that much, frankly. It's weird. It's a weird thing. Anyway, so let's read, and then I started to change. I realized, I was so wrong. So we're going to come down here. I want to show you this right here. Right here. Right here. Mass migration after 1870 augmented the 1910 New World labor force by 49% and reduced the labor force in the immigrant countries around the European periphery by 22%. These big labor supply effects can be easily converted into real wage impact on both the sending and receiving countries. Because the migrants tended to be unskilled and became increasingly so in the late 19th century, they intended to flood labor markets at the bottom in the destination countries. What does flood mean? That means increase the supply. What happens when supply increases? What happens to the price when supply increases? It drops the price. Think about it like this. If you got a neighborhood of 20 houses like I do, and one is for sale, all right, that's going to be your people have nothing to compare it to in terms of prices. But if 3 more go for sale, what does that do to the prices? There's now 4 houses out of 20, which makes the prices go what? The supply increases, the prices go down. Now, you could say, well, that's not true if the demand goes up, but has the demand for homes gone up relative to the increasing supply? In this case, has the demand for labor gone up relative to the increasing labor? And the answer is unequivocally no. We can see here because he says right here. Mass migration implied increasing inequality in rich labor source countries. Emigration implied declining inequality in poor labor abundant countries. All right, so we didn't have enough labor, so we needed to bring labor in from Europe and other states, other countries. And then we got flooded with low-skilled, low-wage labor, which did what? It decreased the wages for those people. And as we can see right here, it'll say this guy right here. The mass migrants tended to flood labor markets at the bottom in destination countries, thus lowering the unskilled wage relative to the skilled wage because we weren't getting skilled labor, we were getting mass unskilled labor, which again is the same thing has happened in the United States since Reagan freaking idiotically allowed for signed Simpson-Masoli to free 3 million illegals. What did that do for carpenters? What did that do for roofers? What did that do for massive unskilled labor in the United States? It drove them out of business, Americans, because now they compete, and probably with harder working Mexicans in Guatemala, to be perfectly honest. I'm not going to say that. I don't know that for sure. But, these guys work their ass off. There's no 2 ways around that. But they came here without a pot to pee, and they're like, you give me $5 an hour on the table, I'll work. Where the Americans like, I need $10 an hour, and Andy got paid Social Security wages. So the employer said, I'm going to pay the Mexican guy. But it's not just the employer, it's the end guy, you and me. We said we like the cheaper labor because we get to get our new kitchen at freaking a third of the cost than if we had to hire American labor. We're all guilty of this, and we need to be better at not being guilty of it for sure. All right, let's keep going because it's interesting here. I'm going to share something here. The result of mass migration was that inequality rose dramatically in rich, labor-scarce New World countries such as Australia, Canada, and the United States, whereas it fell dramatically in poor, labor-abundant countries such as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Italy. Now, what happened was we started to get a globalization backlash, and as such, American doors did not suddenly and without warning slam shut on European immigrants when the U.S. Congress overrode President Wilson's veto of the immigrant literacy test in 1917, or when it passed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921. Over the half century prior to the enactment of the Literacy Act, the United States had been imposing restrictions on what had been free immigration, including contract labor laws, Chinese exclusion acts, excludable classes, head tax, and so on. And have been debating even more severe restrictions. The Quota Act of 1921 was preceded by 25 years of active congressional debate. And 86% of Congress favored more restrictive, according to the first vote on the issue in 1897. So basically what happened here, from 1897 to 1921, almost double the amount of Congress said we need to have restrictions on immigration. And it took 25 years to get there, which is where we're happening now. We're in the midst of a massive reviewing of immigration. It took a long time. Don't you remember in 2007, massive amnesty protests, and Bush was almost ready to sign the amnesty law, almost ready. John McCain was pushing him too. I'm sure freaking Lindsey Grahamnesty was as well. That's why Rush Limbaugh notated her Lindsey Grahamnesty. Lindsey Grahamnesty and Big Mike. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the she, he, their, whatever. She, her, they, share. What the, anyway, guys are just clowns. All of them. And then, and Bush was about to sign it, but he didn't, the Amnesty Act, because enough Republicans said, hell no, we won't go. And then in 2014 or 12, I think it was 14, Eric Cantor lost his primary in the Virginia congressional primary to a guy named Dave Bratt. Dave Bratt was a small-time economics professor at some small-time school, just came out of nowhere and upseated. I think Eric Cantor was like the number 3rd ranking Republican that there was. Kind of like when AOC beat that guy in his primary. Out of nowhere this happened. And that changed the Republican Party, and Dave Bratt saved the Union, because if he did not win, we would have gone Jeb Bush and full amnesty, because we have to appeal to Hispanics by allowing illegals in their neighborhood. Now, screw that. Hispanics don't want that any more than you and I want illegals in our neighborhood. That's just a fact, Jack. Anyway, so what happened was it took a long time. So in 2007, it looked like we were about to lose to amnesty. We started changing. We had Jeb Bush, and then we kicked him to the side. We got Trump. And now even the Democrats are recognizing we can't have, not all of them, but they will be, that we can't have illegals storm the border. We can't. I mean, the Democrats are idiots. I get you. But they put their thing on and say, oh, if we don't change ways, we're going to keep losing elections. I know what's going on right now. We're like, oh, man, it's freaking Maryland, man, and stuff. These guys are idiots. When the polls, they see the polls. And the polls are Americans want immigration reduced. Absolutely. We want all illegals deported for sure. They just released a poll, Rasmussen, about illegal immigration. Do we want them deported or not? And back in like 10 years ago, it was like 36% said yes. Now it's like 58% said yes. So the pendulum is swinging, but even back then, it took a long time, and it's taken a long time now. But let's keep going because it's important. Right here. The Quota Act of 1921 was preceded by 25 years of active congressional debate. Again, and 86% of Congress favored more restriction according to the first vote on this issue than they did in 1897. The U.S. is hardly alone. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada each enacted similar measures. Interesting. Immigration policy has been slow to change, but it's worth noting that countries with the strongest historical persistence of immigration exhibited the biggest policy switch at the end of the period of quiescence. So quiescence, I guess. From wide open to tightly closed. That's us, wide open to tightly closed. And those policy switches usually required long periods of debate. Second, labor market conditions also influence immigration policy, deteriorating living standards of unskilled workers matters, but so does rising inequality. Both are associated with increasingly restrictive immigration policy. The more inequality, the more low-skilled labor working standards and labor costs, essentially in terms of pay, the more restrictive the immigration policies. Thus, evidence right here. The evidence just summarized speaks to the indirect impact of immigration on policy by looking at labor market performance. Low and falling immigrant quality, which is what we're getting in the United States because they're all coming here to mooch off us as opposed to being productive citizens. We want productive citizens, but if you come in here to mooch, get the hell out of Dodge. Low and falling immigrant quality seems to have precipitated more restrictive immigration policy. To some extent, therefore, New World policy anticipated the impact of low-quality immigrants on unskilled wages and moved to shut it down. Yep, and that's what we're going to see here too. New World countries acted to defend the economic interest of unskilled labor. Yep. Right here, immigration policy became increasingly restrictive prior to 1914, and much of this retreat from open immigration policy was driven by defense of the deteriorating relative economic positions of the working poor. Exactly. Globalization planted, right here, its own seeds for destruction because it created rising inequality in labor-scarce economies and falling inequality in labor-abundant economies. The voices of the powerful interest groups were hit hard by these globalization events were heard, generating a political backlash against immigration and trade. What? You hear? Let me read this again. The globalization planted the seeds for its own destruction because it created rising inequality. The voices of powerful interest groups who were hit hard by the globalization were heard, generating a political backlash against immigration and trade. The late 19th century globalization backlash made a powerful contribution to interwar deglobalization. Is this likely to repeat? Maybe not. After all, the migration from poor to rich countries today is pretty trivial compared with the mass migrations of a century ago. Now remember, this was written in 1998, not in 2025. And governments today have more sophisticated ways to compensate losers than they had a century ago with social safety nets and whatnot. Yet history does supply a warning. A backlash against globalization can be found in our past and it might reappear in our future. And 100%, that's what we're doing right now. And just the facts. I mean, this took 25 years from 1897 essentially to 1921 is what this guy is kind of arguing. And again, we started this debate, really, Pat Buchanan really started it, but no one's listening to him in the 90s. Hell, I wasn't. I mean, I love Pat Buchanan, but I wasn't. The immigration, I was, kind of said, I got it. I got the need, you know what I'm saying? I was libertarian and conservative. It was a tough dichotomy there for me. But then I said, oh, the libertarians are crazy. They're wrong. And never mind the want to be, not the anarchist, commie anarchists, but the anarchists on the libertarian side who say no government all, non-aggression principle and all this stuff. The whole thing is just stupid because there's always a bad actor, always a bad actor. And as such, you got to have defense. You got to have sovereignty. You got to have national borders. You can't just let anyone come here. You can't give, even Friedman said you can't have unlimited immigration with a freaking welfare state. You just can't. We know this, and then 2007 came along, and it looked like the death knell for us on the political populist right. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's a couple little guys, a couple little hobbitses said, "No, I'm standing up. I'm saying no." Dave Brad among the others, Trump, and they came along, and now here we are today. And now the debate has shifted dramatically. I can almost guarantee you that the borders will be shut for all immigration here in a couple of years. They're going to say no, because you can see people saying we need zero immigration, not just a reduction of illegal immigration. We need zero, just like in 1920s. They said we're going to shut the thing down. We need high tariffs. No immigration, high tariffs, and the U.S. economy boomed in the 1920s. Kind of crazy, is it not? We still had very limited immigration in the 1950s, and the economy boomed. Kind of crazy. You say, oh, you can't have a growing economy without immigration. It's just not true. You can, absolutely. In fact, it's weird, too. Because what happened to fertility rates, in terms of how many babies they're having? It was dropping, all the way up to the 1920s, and it started rising again. Kind of weird. And once the immigration was shut down in the 50s, it certainly rose, late 40s, 50s. So we basically had a dropping fertility rate, or whatever it is, more baby childbirthing rate. You know what I'm talking about. And then it started rising, and a couple of reasons for that. But one of the reasons, frankly, is because we need more people. People are starting to produce them. Say, hey, there's less labor supply, more good-paying jobs. I want my child to get one of those good-paying jobs. I'm gonna have a baby, and all of a sudden, from 1930s and stuff to 1950s, we had a pretty significant increase in labor. You could argue maybe not until the 1938, 39 stuff like that. I get that, but certainly in the late 40s to the 50s, there's a mass increase in babies being born, and that mass increase was called the baby boom. Anyway, something to think about. I don't know. I'm not going to make a correlation. So, because of immigration, we have an increase in labor. I'm not saying that, but it is something to look at nonetheless, because we know for a fact there are high tariffs in the 1920s, restrictions on immigration, and the economy boomed. 1950s, we still had restrictions on immigration, the economy boomed. That's just a fact. All right, God bless. Love your thoughts. Smash that like button.